Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Dr. James Ogsbury. He was a neurosurgeon for very many years, and this is an exciting interview that we are recording because he is the author of a new book we're publishing at Some Other Publishing called About Not Losing. And this book has been a year in our care and about 30 in its development. Last year, he arrived on the scene with two PDFs of scanned pages, which I then painstakingly turned into a file we could work with. We then spent many months working with that aforementioned file to come up with an actual manuscript. And then now on March 3rd, it will be arriving to digital bookshelves and other sorts of bookshelves. And we're very, very excited about all of that. I could say so much about this project because I have spent so much time with it and editing it and marketing it and going through covers and all this sort of thing. But I'm going to let the author speak for himself and not bore everybody with my view of the project. So, welcome, Jay, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you very much.
Well, why don't we begin from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your book.
I'm a now 82-year-old, 81-year-old retired neurosurgeon with a 30-year history of operative neurosurgery. Trained initially at Cornell and then finished neurosurgery training at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, and had a very nice practice until June, July of 1986, when I accepted a patient with a CSF leak, spinal fluid leak, from a procedure performed in Wyoming. That my job was to get the leak stopped. It took us 2 times to get it stopped, but when during that process the patient developed pneumonia, developed meningitis, and was very sick. But just as she was turning the corner, literally reawakening for the first time, some hospital physicians performed a procedure, that is placement of a intravenous line into the chest, against my wishes, essentially. I said it should be done in no circumstance other than absolute no other access. That wasn't true. There was unfortunately, the lung was entered. The patient developed a collapsed lung. It wasn't recognized. She essentially arrested and had a severe stroke on both sides of the front of her brain, which has left her devastated for the rest of her life. I was so angry that I approached my malpractice company, and to Copic, and to their credit, they put up a lot of money, I believe $1.5 million, for her care for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, her husband was a Shoshone Indian from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and went to someone he knew, Mr. Jerry Spence, the famous attorney up there, and they filed suit for $1 million. Obviously, that forestalled the honorable settlement. During the first trial, Mr. Spence attempted to intimidate us and my attorney, Peter Pryor, into a settlement. Mr. Pryor had acquired the services of Dr. Fran Berman, a psychologist who herself was a Native American, and had trained Peter for 6 months how to face a Native American warrior. And Mr. Pryor strongly opposed Mr. Spence. Mr. Spence thereafter, according to witnesses at the trial, it appeared that he purposefully mistried the case and left the case to do another trial. That required a second trial, and during the second trial, before the second trial, my attorney, Peter Pryor, suggested that I write about the experience of being a defendant in a high-stakes $10 million malpractice trial. I agreed to do so. Interestingly, Mr. Pryor keeps a diary, and he agreed, and Dr. Berman keeps a diary herself because she's a jury foreman, a jury selector, and she did as well. And in essence, we wrote a manuscript about that an entire first trial. We did very well with the first trial, and at the end, it became very clear that we were doing very well, and the last witness changed his testimony, which was not a good thing legally in the case. And so the case settled for a small donation to an Indian tribe, nothing to the attorneys. This was good for the medical legal perspective, but not necessarily good from a literary perspective, because after 3 years, the three of us wrote about our experiences. Our rule was that we could not look at the court manuscript until we had done our writing, so that it would be truly experiential. But we finally wrote about it in 2003, and the trial having been in 1999. We finally wrote about it in 2003, and it was declined for literary purposes because it had come to such an abrupt ending that wouldn't be good for a literary point of view. So the whole project was terminated. We were very sad about that. Well, over the years, I had this recurring dream of finishing the trial. Obviously, my subconscious at work finally decided to, for whatever reason, to write about it. Obviously, a neurosurgeon writing about a trial doesn't work well. But I have a friend of mine who is a ex litigator and now legal educator wrote a dream finishing portion of finishing the trial. And Dr. Berman, who is still in practice, got back into it to write the psychological parts. And lo and behold, we finished 30 years after the other, after 30 years after we wrote the first part, 33 years after the trial, we completed the project. I went to one publisher, and they suggested I come to Something or Other Publishing. Mr. Franzen first suggested your usual methodology, which is to write a sort of short summary, which of course I could easily do, and then come up with a number of people on social media. Well, I'm not on social media, being an old fellow, and so I sent in the whole manuscript, and lo and behold, Mr. Franzen called back and suggested that he set up a whole new process, what he calls the hybrid style, and assigned me to you, Cameron, and we have worked together for the last year putting this together. You have entirely changed the focus of the book from one of just the effects of a trial to a very personal response to, by all of those involving a trial, but particularly the three main characters. And it has become a very personal thing for me in that it is far greater than anything I ever envisioned.
Well, yes. I mean, that is the whole sort of process. You definitely went went through a whole bunch of things I would normally ask about, but that's okay. Um, it's good. The people should know that the book, which you never mentioned the title of, is about not losing. And it'll be with us on March 3rd. And we're in the middle of doing all this marketing on all this sort of thing. I have a little bit of a question about the sort of the writing process. So for people who won't know because they haven't read the book yet because it's not out yet, the book is written from three perspectives. So it's written from Peter Prior's perspective, Jay's perspective, and Fran's perspective, which made it easy to make it about them, sort of thing. And there's bits of trial transcript and personal anecdotes and all this sort of thing. The thing I want to know about is how was it writing your sections and your portions that were not trial transcript? Because most people in medicine are not known for, writing. That's not exactly y'all's jam. So how was it writing all that stuff down?
Well, Peter keeps a diary of every personal diary of every trial in which he's involved. And it turns out that Fran, being a jury selector, does, but particularly in this case, when there were Native American affairs throughout, having spent all that time with Peter training him. Indeed, Fran was the author of the title, in which, at the end of her very first writing, she wrote, "This is not what's at stake. What the public thinks is at stake for a physician being sued. It's not about losing. It's about not winning." And that's where the title came from. We each wrote from our perspective, from our personal perspective.
I think you mean it's not about winning, it's about not losing. It's
about not losing, correct.
Yeah.
That's where the title came from. Peter and Fran wrote basically from their diaries, with very little extra added, except looking at the trial data later on to make sure what they were saying was correct.
But I was asking about you.
Okay, I was basically a kibitzer at the trial, and everything I wrote was written, and it wasn't until 3 years later that I went back to the trial manuscript to get the wording and the quotes correct. So this was actually written as I was hearing it during the trial. So it really didn't come from me. It came from me reporting on the trial.
Right, but the line this is going on is kind of getting into the emotion of it all, of how did you have, in the middle of being in this trial, have the presence of mind to write so much material down?
Well, it turned out that was actually part of the defense of the trial. The manuscript, the book, became an integral part of the trial that we refer to pretty much every day. Again, I wrote down what I was hearing at the trial, and then wrote down my response, if there was one, to what was being said. And sometimes I did not even remember writing the notes that I wrote. There was one very cute little time when my partner, who was very much a technician, broke down, and then later was brought back to being controlled, and talked about his training. And I wrote down, now we're back to Dr. Lee Krauth, who was my partner, the man we know and love. I didn't remember writing that, but that was the point, that I was writing down what I heard and my response to it as the trial actually was happening.
Yes, but there's a lot. One of the things that is interesting about this book, and we're going to go there, is how much of a life-changing moment this was.
Well, as you know, it basically was.
I know, because I've read your book at least 7 times. The listener does not know.
It was very much a life-changing moment. One of the few very good bits of writing that I did, because, again, I didn't go into this as a writer, nor am I really a professional writer, was when we got together 3 years later, and we each had to talk about what it meant to the other two and what it meant to ourselves. And I had trouble wondering what I would write about it, and woke up from REM sleep with the line that basically has been the rest of the manuscript, which was, the character known as Jay no longer exists, which then I could describe the passion for medicine that is all-encompassing when one trains in New York and later in Colorado, but started in New York, where it is your entire life. Your family even is, to a degree, not the primary focus in your life. After the trial, that was gone and never returned. And I realized that the whole rest of my life was doing things that I became interested in, became surrogates for the passion that was lost. I simply could never regain the passion and realized it was a disservice to my patients if I didn't have it, and finally first retired from surgery and then from medicine.
Yeah, that's that's kind of its own. I think that's the real tragedy of the book.
I would guess so, except that I don't look upon the book as a tragedy, but rather as a rediscovery of one's life when a part of one's life is taken away. And the book is really written for people who have undergone multiple other types of tragedies, how to rediscover and how to become a new person that is happy with their existence.
Yeah, I mean, I can I definitely see, I think that's important because people do go through so many things, and sometimes for better or for worse, times in our lives, things that we may have loved, identified with heavily, go away. It just doesn't apply anymore. That, or it's not the same, and we have to move on to other things. What did you do after you retired from surgery?
Um, well, after retiring from surgery, I practiced as a consultant for a while, and that was safe and quite good, but not very exciting. And uh, I I became involved in other things, and at least one of the other things that sort of failed in that I was let go from a job I was on because I was too much a patient advocate, and realized that medicine was just not part of my future anymore. I could not be a surgeon. I didn't enjoy being a consultant particularly, and I was having trouble being involved in healthcare reform from the point of being directly involved at a patient insurance company level, and realized that this just wasn't going to work for me.
I mean, that's a lot of years of school and a lot of drama to go through to just kind of fail out of it.
Well, the point is, if I didn't look upon it as me personally bailing out. I looked upon it as it bailed out on me, and it took me a number of years to realize that the life and even a semblance of a life that I had invested all my training in just was no longer feasible.
Well, and let's go back to the beginning and talk about training. So you were at Cornell and then Colorado and then out in Colorado. Um, what was life like before this malpractice case?
Life was really good. I mean, I still had the New York style passion for medicine. I was very fortunate to join a partner that was a brilliant surgeon, and the only downside was that he was not facile with the use of the microscope, and I tended to use a microscope for everything. But I developed a new partner who was very good at that. And then I developed a friendship with the chief of neurosurgery at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center and shared many difficult cases with him, including developing surgical procedure that is still used but never written about in the book as strangely as a wonderful technical advance. I was very proud about that. Was able to do at least one procedure that I don't think could have been accomplished in any other way using this laser technique that I had developed. And so it was a joy up to then. I
Yeah.
also was very popular in the community because I had the shortest in-hospital stay. And so the work compensation environment, which looks very closely at that, made me very popular in their eyes. And so I worked at a hospital where the care was superlative. And so it was a wonderful life up to then.
Yes, and as I recall, although we're not, you're not getting as much as I would like. You were drafted in Vietnam to go do medicine in Thailand. That's
Well,
all very fascinating.
what happened was that when I was at Cornell, there was a professor whose anxiety when he took care of a well advantaged patient was was stressful. And I finally used what was called the Berry plan, which is a plan where you could sign up to go into the service to forestall being drafted. This was during the Vietnam War, when if you got drafted, even if you were a physician, you were a soldier. So this was a way of getting around that. Well, I used that as a graceful exit from Cornell and spent 1 year in Oklahoma, but then spent a glorious year working in a small hospital in Thailand.
Yes, and that is a whole very exciting story. That is covered a little bit in a blog post that will appear on CameronJournal.com, which is a lot of fun. What was I mean, there's a lot of controversy about all of that. What was that like doing medicine over there in the military auspices?
Well, it was a base that didn't do surgery. It was a triage base, but
Right.
because we had some corpsmen who took care of unusual people at night, and sometimes wrote down that their care was secondary to a strep throat for an otherwise disease, and therefore was owed a favor. We had the ability to obtain almost any equipment whatsoever that was necessary. One time I had a patient with appendicitis, tried to get an airplane to take him down to the main surgical base because I didn't think it was needed that I open up the patient without anesthesia there. And was told that the only airplane available was for the troops. A general called me very nicely to tell me that. But I talked to my radar. We all had a radar. And within 10 minutes, a helicopter arrived, and my patient promptly was taken down to the main surgical base in Thailand. 3 days later, came back cured. I mean, that's how we did things. It was wonderful operating and performing in a situation where, within the limits of your technology, you were able to do whatever it was that worked and took care of your patients without anyone throwing bureaucracy at you or challenging what you were doing. And as long as your results were good, that was good. And it was probably the happiest year of my life medically, even though it was very simple.
Yeah. No, I mean that's a fascinating tale. So then when you get back from Southeast Asia, what happened then?
Well, not very wisely, I had 3 months to go, and I had already been accepted for the returning to residency at the University of Colorado. They, rather than sending me to Buckley, which is in Colorado, where there was an opening, the Air Force, in its wisdom, sent me to Mather in Sacramento, which is a nice base, and it was kind of nice being there. But it was crazy because then they had to move me again, pay for the move again to take to Colorado. So we had a nice 3 months being in California, and then came back.
Well, that was a nice little trip then.
The Air Force paid for it.
Absolutely. So, why did you pick Colorado? Why did you decide to leave to New York and come out to Colorado?
Well, that was when I came. There is a thing in regular residency, an internship called a matching program, where the hospital lists its priorities and the doctor lists its priorities, and wherever they match, the top of where they match, that's where you go. When you come into a residency later on, there's no such thing. And so I realized that I had applied to 5 top-notch programs. I might not be accepted at any one of them. So I decided, knowing that once I got an acceptance, I probably had a week to 2 weeks to decide. You couldn't wait around to see what else was there, that I would just take the first one that was offered. Colorado at that point had a very famous neurosurgeon, Dr. Keesley Welch, who literally just before I got there went off to Harvard. And it was a great program, and that's how I came to Colorado.
Well, I mean that's also kind of very accidental. There was no intention there.
Well, I was just hoping to get into one of the 5, and whichever one accepted me first, that's where I was going.
Well, Colorado got lucky.
I don't know about that, but yeah, it's a wonderful place, that's for sure. And the program is evolved into a wonderful program too.
Yeah, and so then you are then and so how did you meet Lee Krauth? Now, for those who doesn't know, Lee Krauth was your partner at the time that this trial starts in 1989 with this procedure in 1986. How did you meet Lee Krauth?
Lee was I'm not sure when I exactly met him, but he was my junior resident while I was training. So
Yeah.
that's how I got to know him well.
That I mean that's that. So when did you decide to go into go into practice together?
Well, as soon as he got out, he was trained partially by the military, and he was sent to Wilford Hall in Texas, the main neurosurgery center down there, to join their program. Their top neurosurgeon, the senior neurosurgeon, did not do complex brain surgery. Their second fellow got into some sort of trouble, which made Lee, as a junior program neurosurgeon right out of training, the top intracranial brain spinal cord neurosurgeon. So he spent 2 years there, where the top neurosurgeons in the whole Southwest would come and help him with difficult cases. So it was like a 2 year fellowship with all of the world class neurosurgeons that were in the region. So obviously he was extraordinarily well trained. And when he got out of that, then we joined. He did things that I didn't dream of doing because of his experience training with all these famous neurosurgeons.
Oh, okay. Um, that's yeah. So I mean, was there any particular reason you picked him, or just because it just seemed to work out?
Well, in part because he was, even then, I was not happy being a vascular aneurysm surgery. It just wasn't something I was comfortable doing. I did it well in training, but you always have the professor sort of guiding you along in training. When you go out in the real world, it's not like that. And he specialized in aneurysm vascular surgery. So I basically felt, and he felt too, that our strengths, I was a tumor spine doctor and he was a vascular tumor doctor. So our strengths melded very well.
Okay. That yeah, that's definitely. I mean, that definitely makes. I always find that kind of fascinating, where it's just it's like we weren't really friends, we didn't really know each other, but it just seemed to work, so we did it. That always amazes me.
Well, this was very much a practical surgical skill decision.
Yeah, rather than any other secondary consideration.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So then, why don't so the book it covers the terrible, sad situation of this patient. Um, and I would ask you to walk us through the day, but you kind of already did. But through the case and what happened. So let's start with where you didn't go, which was after she had her terrible stroke and she was incapacitated. Um, what happened in the days and weeks afterwards before the lawsuit and the trial?
Well, initially she was comatose. She finally did wake up, but had what they call the loss of executive functions. Executive functions are those functions that allow you to organize whatever you're doing. She can type a typewriter, she can push the keys of a typewriter, but she can't make a word on the typewriter. And it's not a
Right.
word finding because she could talk. She slowly woke up, and finally, I think in September, I was mortified because she was sort of my favorite patient from the very beginning, and for this to happen to her, and I kicked Lee off the case to protect him from the obvious medical legal thing that was to follow, um, and so he didn't know, he wasn't involved at all in her care from pretty much that time forward. And finally,
Mm.
in mid or late September, I flew with her in the governor's plane back to Wyoming to take her home to make sure that her doctors and family knew what was going on with her and what her capabilities were and were not. Uh, she slowly woke up. Interestingly, despite the lawsuit, I remained friendly with her sisters, uh, with her daughters, who were caring for her largely at home, and helped them a lot on their care of their mother.
Yeah, that's I think that's one of the I think that and I'm surprised you haven't mentioned this. One of the things that I think really turned the trial around in your favor was all the aftercare that you did for her and her family. That really touched the jury, didn't it?
I think so. I mean, juries are always looking for the personal side of the defendant. And I didn't try to sell that. This is just what went on. But from the moment it happened, as I said, I was angry at what happened, and particularly questioned myself, should I just stayed in the hospital for her entire care, and physically prevented others from becoming involved. I always wondered about that. I questioned there was an issue of whether super glue was used at the first operation to help seal it. It actually wasn't. And I always questioned, maybe even though it wasn't FDA approved and probably not the medical legal thing to do, should I have done it, because it might have worked the first time and forestalled the need for a second operation, and then all of the things that happened thereafter. So I had tremendous emotional involvement in her care. I spent pretty much every day, most of the day, with her care, or with
Yeah.
working on her care while she was in the hospital.
Yeah, that was, I think, I think that was a big turning point. I think there were two turning points in the whole trial, realizing that you had been so invested in her care and afterwards and all this type of thing, and had really worked with the family and whatnot. And then also Lee Krauss' big breakdown. I think those were the big turning points.
Well, the other thing was that the attorney who took over the case and tried it strictly on issues. He only had about 2 weeks to prepare, and he was left by Spence's team with about three or four things that they believed that I had done incorrectly. And the most important one, and I bring this up only because I do think this was a major intellectual turning point, was that they believed that my first operation was inappropriately or not correctly performed, and that when Lee came back, he had been away. We did it together, and he did it with a technique that he somehow had developed. It's not written anywhere, and it's basically involving not trying to close the little hole that goes from the brain side to the sinus, but opening it further and packing the sinus with muscle. Something that's still not written, nor have I heard of anyone doing it in this location, although maybe in others. And one turning point came when they projected on the wall the pictures of my operation and the anatomy of my operation, which was basically in the brain, and his operation, which was basically in the sinus getting there from the brain side. And the
Right.
moment they could see the difference, one of the things we noticed was there was one juror that was very attentive and very obviously attuned to what was going on, and he very aggressively closed his notebook, actually with an audible slap. And you could tell that his question had been answered. So I think that was, along with the fact that they realized that we were caring. Part of the problem was that they tried to use Lee against me because the main neurosurgery witness turned out to be trashed by Mr. Pryor, with questions such as, if this or that are true, would it not be negligent to do this? And one of the things they got from him was that he didn't know what happened to her after those first few days, and tried to make him and therefore me to appear uncaring. So the fact that you brought out that Lee actually brought out in the testimony, because I didn't testify, what I was doing, which he knew about and found out later about, had a big emotional impact on the jury.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other kind of aspect that I think is very interesting, um, is that initially Sharon had gone in to have her sinuses scraped to fix her allergies. And that's what poked the sinus and broke the brain barrier, right?
Correct. In Wyoming, yes.
Yes. Walk us through that. How does this happen?
It's actually doesn't it's not as bad sounding as it is. The top of the sinus, the cribriform bone up there, is very, very thin. So they literally have to scrape the inflamed mucosa off of the sinus. The covering of the sinus now is thickened because of the infection. They have to scrape it off this bone and literally get it all out without breaking the bone. So you can
Right.
imagine, if you have a paper thin bone there, it's not hard to just break the bone. And probably that happens much more frequently. What happened in this case was that obviously an instrument plunged through and tore the dura, the covering of the brain, as well as got in a little tiny bit into the brain. Nothing terrible, but the key thing was that it tore the dura. If the dura had been intact, nobody would have known. But
Right.
it's I think a not uncommon complication to break the cribriform from below just because of what's needed to do. Now that they have endoscopes and they could see what they're doing, that was a blind procedure back then. They have endoscopes and they could see, so they do it better. But it still involves scraping mucosa off of a paper thin bone.
Yeah. That's just, it's just, I remember the first time you told me that and finally explained what it was. I was floored at something so simple that was probably outpatient done in an afternoon, literally ruined this whole woman's whole life. Just absolutely shocking.
Absolutely. And that's the tragedy.
Absolutely. Well, we are at that portion of the show. We're at about 45 minutes in, where we normally do plugs and where to find John Lennon, where to buy the book. You don't have any of that stuff. So I'm going to help you and let people know that starting in February, there's going to be a series of articles about Mr. Ogsbury's life that covers many of the topics we've discussed here at CameronJournal.com. So please keep an eye out for those. Sign up for the newsletter because they'll be in there. The book will be out on March 3rd. It will be available everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, internationally, all this sort of thing. And it's called About Not Losing. If you would like to pre-order, there's a discount, especially for the hardback, which is very expensive. If you want to pre-order hardback, paperback, or ebook, head over to soupllc.com and you can pre-order for release on March 3rd. After that, everything goes up to full price. So if you want a discount, now is the time. So that's where to get a hold of the book and also to make sure to check out the blog post. By the time this will come out sometime in February, and I'll link the ones that are available at that time. But kind of fills out a lot of the extra stuff about his time in the military and time beforehand and a little bit after the trial and all this type of thing. And even gives us a preview of what I think is the most powerful part of the book, which are the ending reflections. There's 3 of them that take place at different times, including one I forced him to write for this book now. So it's good. So it's a lot of fun, and so that's where to find the book. That's where to keep up with all of this. And thank you so much, Dr. Ogsbury, for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Sure, it's been my pleasure and privilege.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.